Great. Welcome to this panel, and I hope we'll have a chance to mix it up a little bit. A lot has been put out into the room in the opening remarks here that I think we could chew on for a bit, but we'll have a chance to delve into some business perspective on these questions. And so with that, I'm really delighted to welcome George Barrett from Cardinal Health, David Langstaff, who's been founder and chief executive officer of a public company and another company in the defense industry, and Nathan Rosenberg, who's a founding partner of Insigniam. So, but let me just pause for a second and just say what my own interest in this issue is. I think there's kind of three reasons that I'm really honored to be here today. One is to be back with my pal Steve Odlin, who as executive at Office Depot was heavily involved in the work and kind of our business anchor in the work we did started back in 2005 and forward on curbing short-termism in business and capital markets. And so it's a real pleasure to be back here working with Steve in his capacity here at CED, which has been working on these issues for many years now. Second of all, I really care deeply about the question of money in politics. If I wasn't working on curbing short-termism, that's the issue I'd be working on. They are closely intertwined here. I'm a member of the board of the Center for Political Accountability and would like to commend taking a look at the Zicklin Index, which they produce, which is a way of tracking and encouraging corporations to be transparent about political spending. So that is an important question that's going to come up again today. And then finally, I'm at the Aspen Institute, and the tensions that underpin democracy and capitalism are have been a call of the Aspen Institute and an organizing principle for its work for over 60 years now. At the Business and Society program, our kind of organizing principle is a deep belief that business is the institution of our day. With all respect to government, it is a fount of incredible knowledge and problem-solving skill. It draws remarkable amount of talent. And we need business at the table to solve the kinds of problems that the congressman just spoke of. Without business at the table, we are not bringing the lift we can to solve our most important problems. But we don't believe we can do it with a short-term view. And so these questions come back for me in the context of how we actually continue to support a system which has given so many of us who are baby boomers something we've come to count on, but we're not so sure we're going to be able to grant to our own children. So, but let me just step back from this now, and in the context of using the CED report as kind of a backdrop, just remind us of the framing that they suggested for the panel today, saying that the remarkable success of capitalism in the US has been made possible by widespread public support for that very same system. However, in recent years, support has eroded. What can be done to evolve the interactions of democracy and capitalism to restore public trust and improve broadly shared economic growth? So I thought what I'd do is start out here with kind of some basic questions of our panelists, and then we'll be opening it up to the room. But I'm kind of curious, starting maybe, David, you were actually involved in this report and have been a member of CED for some years now. Kind of what's keeping you awake at night on this issue of kind of the role of corporations, the health of capitalism, and then we'll kind of move down the line and come back around to go a little deeper on some of these questions.
Okay, thanks, Judy. It's terrific being here, not only with my role with CED, but my role with you in the Aspen Institute. What keeps me awake? You know, I fundamentally am most worried that we don't realize how severe the problem is. And, you know, let me just share an image. You know, in my life, of course, one of those moments in time where you all knew where you were is when man landed on the moon. And one of the great images of that whole moon launch and moonland was actually looking back at the Earth from the moon and how that changed the way we think about the Earth, and just seeing that very fragile protective shell of the environment. I think we need to look at capitalism the same way. And if you look back, if we step back and look at capitalism, I think we'll find that our environment that protects our system is public trust. And we are losing it, or have lost it. And I think it's one of those things that you lose incrementally, and all of a sudden it's gone. And so that's what really keeps me up. And I think we, CED, have an opportunity here, beginning with, not ending with, this look at crony capitalism, but to take a look at the system of capitalism and to take a systems view of it and really bring sort of our understanding of the shades of gray, of the nuance, and how cause-effect occurs, and really look at the whole system. And I think if we can do that, we are really offering something different. So our work begins with crony capitalism, but I don't think that's the essential focus of what we need to be doing over the next few years.
Let me just ask a follow-up before we move down. What piece of this do you think about the most? In other words, for you, where are these issues really alive? Because I think we talk a lot about the health of capitalism, but kind of in your role as an executive, where do you see it? I think you know, the tension that any CEO has is the tension of balancing the short-term, the requirement of short-term performance with the stewardship obligation of overseeing an institution for the long term. So it comes down in the short-term and long-term tension. And I think what's happened is that balance is no longer in balance. And all of our metrics, all of our systems pressures are for more and more short-term decisions in favor of the financial shareholder at the expense of the other constituents and at the expense of the long-term health of the institution. So I think that's at the core of the problem. Thanks. Nathan, how about you? What part of this do you think about?
Judith, first of all, I think words count. I think language is important, and words aren't fungible. And I think we should stop talking about capitalism, because nobody's interested in capitalism. Capitalism is a term that was coined by a French socialist in 1850 to talk about people who were excluded from the access to capital. What Americans are interested in, and what has produced all that benefit that Steve talked about in his introduction of the congressman, is free markets and free enterprise. And there's not one person in this room, and there's not many people in this United States who don't benefit very directly from the free enterprise system. And so just to coattail off David's point is, I think the first thing is that markets are founded in trust. Markets are founded in integrity. And whether it's Boeing asking for government guarantees on its airplane sales, or it's Elon Musk and his car company getting huge benefits from tax credits, or it's anybody looking for unfair advantage in the marketplace, I think those CEOs and those executives are poking themselves in the eye while they're looking to gain benefit in the marketplace. And I just think all of us who are business leaders, if we stand for free markets, then our actions have to follow from our stand, and we can't look for advantages for our companies. We got to be willing to play in a level market level playing field, and in that level playing field, there's winners and losers.
Thanks. George, how about for you? What part of this keeps you awake at night?
Yeah, this is an interesting subject. And John and I have talked, a number of us, a lot about this, and the congressman made reference to this question of cynicism, the breakdown of trust. I don't think it's just about individuals and their businesses. It's about individuals and their institutions. That's government, that's their church, that's wherever. And it's this basic concept that those in power are disproportionately benefiting and using that power in various ways, and money is a part of that discussion. I don't think it's the only part of the discussion, actually. And so for me, there's a practical impact of this breakdown in trust for business, for the way we're perceived in our communities, for the support that we get in the way policy is made and how effective policy is made. We know that a very angry, unhappy, distrusting America is likely to push for change that may or may not be carefully thought through. And I think we will see the byproduct of this breakdown in trust and bad policy. I would add one other piece to it, which is, I think for all of us who run companies, it can be treacherous space to be standing up here and talking about trust, right? You do so at great peril, and I actually think that's one of our problems. We have disengaged on some level from the big issues of the day. And there are all kinds of pressures. You could say it's short-term, long-term, but I would argue it's sort of narrow-broad. So one of the things that we've done as a company is we've decided that there are big issues that matter and that we're going to be active in those. And that can be stressful when you're a public company. You've got to be able to demonstrate to your shareholders that that is in their interest. I think we can make the argument very forcefully that it is in the interest of our shareholders. But I think in very tense times like this where cynicism is high, we tend to retreat, actually. And when, in fact, we should be leaning forward and saying these are big issues of the day, they're not easily solved, but we're willing to go the distance to actually tackle and work on some of these issues, whether it's education or any other huge social issue that we face.
Can you give an example of where breakdown in trust has actually affected business at Cardinal Health?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably point to some policy areas where I think we devote an extraordinary amount of our resources doing things that are probably low productivity. They don't add to the safety and the quality of the system that we serve in healthcare. But we understand where it comes from. Again, it's coming from a place of frustration, and so I think that frustration comes through the legislative process, and then we see that, and then we do the best that we can to try to make it actionable. But we see it very practically in policy. I'd add another, just an element, and maybe it's just an example. We've been very involved in Columbus, Ohio. Our company's headquartered just outside Columbus. And we decided as a business community that we were going to sort of re-engage in this issue of education. Columbus has been on this real renaissance as a city. And one of the areas that's been a real struggle for us has been true in many cities is our city schools. We convened, the mayor asked me to co-chair a commission with him to look at our education systems. We had representatives from every part of the city, the community, the faith-based community, the unions, the teachers. The involvement of the business community in that, on some level, disabled the work for quite a period of time, because the assumption was that the business community was there to take over the system to create some kind of a gain for the business community. And in fact, what we've had to do is to say, look, this is going to be a long haul, and we're in for the long haul, and we're going to actually have to work with the community to say why we're doing this. But it was a really striking example of the pushback from people that just don't really trust.
Nathan, do you have an example of where kind of breakdown of trust has actually affected your business?
As a consultant, I've probably been fired 3 or 4 times.
You could go back a couple businesses if you need to.
Fortunately, not for a failure of trust.
But I mean public trust now.
Yeah,
I don't mean...
But, you know, I was actually thinking on the opposite side. We work at a family-owned company called SC Johnson & Son. And Fisk Johnson is the 5th Johnson to run the company. His dad... a big piece of their business is aerosols, and his dad eliminated CFCs from their aerosols because he knew it was doing damage to the environment. There was no legislation, there was no regulation from the, I don't even think the EPA existed at the time probably, or just had come into existence. But again, Judith, I think it goes back to all of us who are in leadership positions. The foundation of leadership is integrity, and we know what's right and we know what's wrong, and there's a difference between right and wrong and legal and not legal. And that lines, those distinctions aren't often made, and I think the failure of trust certainly comes from illegal stuff, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think it comes from doing something while it's legal, it's just wrong. And you know, I think CEO compensation today is a huge issue in how the American people view our system, because men and women are getting inordinate salaries compared to the value that they actually create and generate, not just for the shareholder, but for the consumers. So I think the whole thing of integrity is really at the core, and then The other thing is in this city, there's an iron triangle between what's now become professional congressional staffs. You know, when I worked here 35 years ago, when I was the National Security Advisor, the majority leader in the Senate, most of us came to Washington for 3 or 4 years, and then we went and got a real job. Today, there are people on the Armed Services Committee staff who came when they were 22, and they're going to retire in those jobs at 65. The professional bureaucracy in Washington, and then the lobbyists, and that's part of what feeds into crony capitalism in a way that, you know, 35 or 40 years, I just don't think was the case. So I think those are all issues of breakdowns in trust.
Let me pick up on one theme that's come out of this so far, and then kind of maybe turn to the congressman to see what he's hearing from this conversation, to see what we're missing. And then I want to turn us to solutions before we open it up. My own observation of the failure of business to lead today, I think is witnessed in some of the question about infrastructure and the lack of kind of public will to get that done. I think we're seeing it in the lack of action on climate change. It feels to me that if you kind of look back at our history as a nation, kind of going back to the Dutch colony, that business and private initiative has always been kind of self-interest of business, if you will, has been an important piece of kind of those inflection points when we had to double down and get something done. Whether it was the founding of this organization, CED, and the work that they did to kind of create jobs for the men who were coming back from Europe after the war, whether it was the building of the railroads, or, you know, we could name other kinds of points of investment in kind of our future. And it doesn't feel like that today to me. That the organizations like the Business Roundtable and other organizations that stand for kind of the power and will of business to get things done seems to me to be more focused on the individual needs of those businesses and industries, and that we're missing something in the public sphere. So I want to ask, if I'm seeing some nodding heads, so I'm glad, at least from the businessmen, I'm seeing the nodding head. I'm not sure what you think yet, Mr. Sarbanes. But I'm kind of curious about this, and if you agree with me, first of all, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on it, or if you disagree. But why? What is holding back the business community from really stepping up and organizing in a way that we could start to maybe shift this conversation in places where we're now stuck? So let me start with you, George, on that, or anybody else who wants to jump in.
I'll try in this. I'm not sure that I'd categorically say that all business has stepped back from this. I mean, I think we could talk about business associations, and as those tend to evolve, the subjects can get narrow. But I know some really outstanding businesses that recognize that they are in a broader context and are stepping in big ways. I think our company has done that. You know, we've done that in our communities. We've done that around education. We've done that around substance abuse. So we've tried to do that. I think companies in general understand that they're part of a bigger context, but it is a very risky environment. I mean, I do think that all of us recognize that with the world as horizontal as it is, and information moving very quickly, you put yourself in harm's way when you're engaged in the big subjects that invariably bring some heavy ideological discussion. So it's possible that we shy away too much from it for fear of being criticized or seen as hypocrites. I think it's not necessary, and I think many people are beginning to do that. I think it's our opportunity, if we're going to sustain capitalism and sustain growth. I think people have to regain some belief that we have a bigger interest, and that the stakeholder system of ours is broad, and that ultimately, if we do that well, that creates value for the shareholders. So that's my view. Our organization, I think, is embracing that, and our board embraces it.
What's risky about it?
Well, I think we're under a microscope. Again, those of us who run, let's say, good-sized publicly traded companies, I think we recognize that that's, we heard earlier about activism and the pressures that companies feel to stay on message, on target, very clear. And I think that you can wind up thinking too narrowly about what that means. And the reality is what we're trying to do, at least our business, is to create value for our customers, and we recognize that that is a broad base, that our stakeholders are multidimensional, and that when we engage them, and especially our employees, that good things tend to happen. But that is not always the easiest argument to make when there are intense short-term pressures. And I think the key is to be able to articulate that and to be transparent about it. You use the word transparency. It's not just about how you spend your money. It's why you do what you do. Why should a shareholder care that we do X? Because it is in our interest as a corporation to have a population of people in this community that are well educated and prepared for life.
Right. David, I see your mic up.
Yeah.
You have thoughts?
Is it on? Okay. So, I mean, I think the question you're asking is exactly right. And I think what we've lost is an answer to the question of whose interest are companies serving. And you know, if you go back a number of decades, I mean, business was understood. There was this implicit compact with society that business is there to do good, and by doing good, you do well, and the various constituents do well. Somewhere along the way here, and it probably goes back to Milton Friedman in the early 70s, we got this notion that businesses are for or owned by the shareholder. And any executive, I mean, as George is saying, any executive who's had an operating role knows that if you don't have customers, if you're not thinking about employees, the shareholder is honestly last to a well-functioning business. And if the business does well, the shareholders do well. And the best articulation of that is General Johnson's credo when he took Johnson & Johnson public. So I think what we have to get back to, and interestingly, there's a surge of interest in this question in business schools today, is purpose, corporate purpose. What's it for? And I think once we start a discussion about that, it enables us to have a different discussion about, well, what is executive leadership? And I think we need to rediscover what's been out there for ages, and that is this whole notion of stewardship. And so if you really come into the job with the idea that I got to leave this better than I got it, and I need to leave this institution strong because this institution is contributing good things to society, that's a different mindset. And it gives you a moral argument for a discussion with shareholders, with activists, investors, and such, that frankly, CEOs have to have the courage to step up and articulate. So I think there's a lot of lack of leadership around here that we all share, which is why I'm excited about what CED is doing here, because we got a lot of CEOs in this crowd, and what Aspen's doing, we should be able to put this into a context and affect change in ways that a lot of these single issue shrill voices can't do.
Thanks. Congressman Sarbanes, what would you add to this part of the conversation?
Is it on? There we go. It's a pretty depressing conversation, but
we're going to get to the cheery part.
But there's hope, I think. Well, to your point about, we don't seem to be able to tackle the big issues like infrastructure, for example. I think what's happened is, I'll just speak for what's happened to lawmakers in Washington. I think we've been conditioned to think small. So in other words, let's say the process, if we had regular order, which is what Congress is always trying to get back to, regular order. That's where committees meet and you sit down around conference room tables and you kind of hash things out based on their merits. Even if you could get around a conference room table, and that's hard to do these days, you'd certainly bring the lens of, is the policy we're discussing here beneficial, important to my constituents? You have a responsibility to bring that lens. A second lens you bring is, what does it mean for the country? You bring that national perspective and lens. But too often, the third lens that's brought, and now in some ways the most dominant lens, is what would my money patrons think if I agreed to that provision or I compromised on this? Or should I be sitting here the whole time instead of thinking about what's in the interest of the country and my constituents, thinking for where the opening is going to come for me to put in that special favor that I'm seeking for the people that I need to raise all that money from. And because there's such pressure on members of Congress to raise these incredible amounts of money. In the House, every 2 years, the average cost of a winning campaign for Congress is $1.6 million. You have to chase the money. You're in a money chase all the time, and it starts to affect the way you look at your job. And I don't think that's because members of Congress are bad people. Most of them are there for the right reasons, and they want to do the right things. But they've been captured by a system that distorts their ability to basically process the will of the people. So when big issues come before us, we get distracted, or we go off sort of on these tangents with small thinking that is affected by this dynamic that I just described to you. And I think if we could get back to where members of Congress could actually spend their time in Washington studying legislation, meeting with each other, engaging with business and other leaders out there in the society to reach the best policy for the country, that would be a wonderful return to a time that frankly doesn't exist anymore. And I'll tell you a story to put an exclamation mark on this, or punctuation mark. Back in, I think it was 1982, the year I referenced before, John Stennis, who was head of the Foreign Affairs or the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, senator from Mississippi, senior senator from Mississippi, he, for the first time, was facing a real challenge from a guy named Haley Barbour, who was going to raise a lot of money and spend a lot of money. And they sent some consultants to Stennis and said, you know, you're going to need to raise $1 million, $2 million. I mean, he'd never raised more than a few $100,000 to run a Senate campaign. Can you imagine? And he said, well, how am I going to do that? And the consultant said, well, you know, your committee has jurisdiction over all of these defense contractors and firms and so forth, and you know, you ought to go to them and ask them if they'll contribute to your campaign. And Stennis's response to that was, would that be proper? So we've moved from where a lion of the Senate, John Stennis, reacted to that proposition by wondering if it would even be proper, to where that has become standard operating procedure for members of Congress. That describes to you what this journey has been. And you can bet that in those days, the John Stennises of the world were ready to handle the big questions, right? And assemble people around the common good of the country. And we need to get back to that, but we're not going to get there if we don't somehow fix this system that is bearing down on lawmakers in terms of the money.
That's more optimistic.
So, George, I want you to get in here, but I want to, it feels to me like we have a complex dance here.
Yes.
And this is a highly connected problem, because you sound an awful lot like a CEO of a public company talking about the quarterly, mindset. And so the pressure for public companies to continue to stay on that treadmill is one of the factors that's driving the kind of behavior that I think we're seeing here. That's my opinion. Sorry, I just stepped out of my moderator role. Apologies. George, over to you, and then I want to take some soundings from the room and then come back and let's see if we can talk about solutions. Who's the first mover here?
So let me a couple of quick observations, be slightly less depressing, maybe. As much as the glue that we feel sometimes in this city is happening, and for all the reasons we've discussed, there's a lot of amazing stuff happening locally. And I think we should not ignore it. And I actually think that we may discover, and that some of the things that we'd like to see, people tackling the big issues, demonstrating the ability to lead with a big view rather than a small view, is happening in places locally, and that it may spread. Number one. Number two, we have a generation of young folks who actually are extremely mission-driven. We see that in our organization. Very much connected to why do we do this? What is it about? What does authenticity mean in terms of us as an organization? When we say something, do we actually live it? So I think there's some things to be optimistic about with all of the things that are making us depressed. The other thing I'll just add is this, and what to do about it. A lot of this, to me, again, this issue of trust is you have to treat it like any other business strategy. You have to say, we are going to be purposeful about this, that we are going to build a system and a positioning as a company and the compact with our people and our shareholders and our stakeholders that says something about who we are and why we're going to create value through that work. And so I think what we often do is think of this as just sort of something that's out there. And I would say what you have to do is make it purposeful, strategic, and you say that we are going to reestablish ourselves, whether it's in this community or as a thought leader on the Hill, not necessarily as the funder, but the thought leader, and you do it purposefully.
Judith, can I just jump in for a second?
Yes, please. And if there's a mic about to circulate, if you kind of signal if you're ready to talk, and we'll take a couple of soundings and then come back to the panel.
This was in the Journal at the end of last month. Pew Research runs a survey every year. Most people are better off in a free market economy, even though some people are rich and some are poor. Do you agree or disagree? In the United States, 70% of those surveyed say that they agree either strongly or mostly with that statement. And only 20...
Wait, which way? That they agree that you're better off?
You're better off in a market economy. And only 25% disagree strongly or mostly with that. Now, what's interesting is the sentiment hasn't gotten as high as it was in 2008, right before the crash. Right before the crash, it was at 76%, and again, it's now at 70%, but it's recovered slightly. It's gone up since the crash. In the UK, those who agree is 65%, and then interestingly, Argentina, which has obviously a broken economy, it's exactly the opposite. More people disagree with the statement than agree with the statement. So I think one of the things is there's a really strong base to build on of good sentiment in this company for free markets and free enterprise. And then, as George said, as business leaders, we've got to do our job and speak out and be in support of it. Also, I think it's a little bit ironic talking about lobbyists in the hotel where the name comes from.
Yeah.